The first CEO is seen as a sacrificial lamb. Yes, right after the founder.
Transferring power to others, even trusted, highly experienced individuals, is still a stressful process.
A common issue is appointing CEOs but failing to grant them real authority.
There was a specific case where a strong CEO came in and burned out within 6 months because responsibilities were piled on, KPIs were defined, the expectation was deliver.
So how should the board respond to something like this?
The board must be capable of saying no repeatedly. Sometimes even the mere presence of the owner in the office is already a big red flag. Yes.
A CEO must have full authority, otherwise they are not truly a CEO.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. As we mentioned earlier, it's important to learn not only from positive experiences, but also from failures in order to avoid falling into the survivorship bias trap. That is, when all conclusions are drawn from successful cases, while the problems and risks that lead to negative outcomes are overlooked. That's why Irina Papusha and I decided to create a series of episodes focused specifically on board-level failures, where we discuss the challenges boards face and how these issues are addressed.
Good afternoon. And today, we will talk about one of the most common responsibilities of a board, appointing a CEO. Not just the responsibility itself, but the challenges that come with it. A common problem is appointing a CEO and not granting that CEO the authority. Very often, owners establish boards, invite and form them at the point when they want to step away from day-to-day operations. Alternatively, a board comes in, diagnoses the company, and realizes that the business has already outgrown its owner, and that the owner in one way or another is holding back further development. In such cases, the board proposes separating the roles of owner and CEO. But is it really that simple? Let's talk about it today.
And our experts will help us navigate this. Roman Koziuk and Armen Krogenyan. Hi, everyone.
Greetings.
Greetings.
Good afternoon.
I suggest we start with a quick icebreaker. Let's recall our own experiences. We have all gone through the CEO journey. Some of us are still serving as CEOs today, Armen, and some have already transitioned to purely non-executive roles. But we all come from a CEO background. Let's think back to our very first steps in that role. What was it like? Very briefly, this is a blitz round. What was the most supportive factor for you? And what was the most negative?
I would say that speaking about the role of the owner's position and support are especially critical at the beginning when you take on authority and responsibility. Owner support is important, but it is also crucial that at some point it gives the CEO real freedom to operate. For me, at the time when I started taking on senior executive roles, it was exactly about that initial push and then being let go. I think this moment is exactly the key one. If the owner understands what kind of force to apply, what push to give, and when to let go and allow free sailing, that seems to me absolutely critical for a first-time CEO at the beginning.
Speaking for myself, until recently my owner was the Ministry of Defense. It's a rather impersonal type of ownership, driven more by directives and instructions rather than personal interaction. And the challenge there is finding the right balance. After all, you are running an enterprise that is expected to generate revenue and operate as a business, while at the same time dealing with a significant volume of reporting of many different kinds. And accordingly, even your role in communicating with the owner becomes something like a GR practice. You need to know how to speak with authority, with an owner who is the authority. That, I would say, is one of the biggest challenges. But in fact, I can say that I manage it well, and it's one of my core skills. Let's call it a GR practice skill.
Sergey, how was it for you?
It was a slightly different situation because I became the CEO of a company whose majority shareholder was a private equity firm where I had worked for many years. So the issue of trust had already been resolved long before I became the CEO. In fact, I probably became CEO precisely because that trust was already there. Given the nature of how private equity enters projects, there is typically a more hands-on involvement from the owner in certain areas, so I had to manage, and sometimes even partially restrain, the owner's attempts to dive too deeply into operational matters.
Let me share my experience. My first CEO role came when I had just turned 30. It was within the Foxtrot group of companies, and I was offered the opportunity to lead one of the holding's most ambitious business lines. At that time, Foxtrot's co-owner, Ole Holovin, gave me full carte blanche. I wouldn't say I was scared, but I definitely wanted to consult with him. And he would tell me, come to me when you're really scared. Everything else, just go and do it. Whenever I came to him at the moment when I was scared, he would tell me, don't be afraid. That was probably the best thing an owner could have done because essentially he was encouraging me while giving me the space to show maximum initiative and boldness. And he demonstrated that he trusted me. Go for it. That trust, in turn, only increased my sense of responsibility. I understood that I couldn't afford to fail when someone trusted me that much. And I realized that, in many ways, nothing better could have happened in my career than that kind of approach. So today, let's reflect on how important it is for an owner to extend that trust. What tools can be used to communicate it? And how can a board help build such trust-based, accountable relationships so that the business can grow and perform more successfully?
Colleagues, considering both your experience as CEOs and your experience as non-executive directors, what do you see as the main challenges in transferring authority from the owner to the CEO?
I would say the primary challenge ultimately lies within the owner, because the issues I've encountered are precisely those where owners are simply not ready. This may in part be shaped by our Ukrainian business culture, our founders, and the environment we operate in. In Ukraine, it's not enough for an owner to just build a business model. They also have to navigate relationships with government institutions, along with the constant high-level stress we face. It's been one crisis after another, then one revolution, then another, then a war. So imagine trying to hand over your own business, your own creation, to someone else, almost like entrusting your child to foster parents, if I were to use that analogy. I own a business myself, a business publishing company that's fully operational. And to be honest, I'm the sole owner, and even now I still do pretty much everything myself from start to finish. And putting myself in that position, once again, transferring authority to others, even trusted and highly experienced people, is still stressful, still a real challenge. You never fully know how a board or a trusted executive will act in a given situation compared to how you would have handled it. You know, there's this issue of command style. I like to recall the story of Napoleon, who would assign his marshals to take positions without telling them exactly how to do it. They were highly experienced, and as far as I understand from history, he trusted them completely. But our owners often feel the urge to explain how, to impose their own worldview on the method of achieving the goal. I won't take up more time, I'll give you the floor, but for me, this is the core issue, and I'll expand on it further with an example.
I completely agree with the challenges you've outlined, but I think the root cause is somewhat different. I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to national specifics. Francis Fukuyama once, before declaring the end of history, for which he is often criticized today, wrote a book called Trust, where he explored in detail how religious and cultural characteristics of different societies shape the development of the corporate world. At the core of it is trust in strangers. For example, why don't Italian companies often become global players? Because they tend to develop within family structures, and when the family's capacity is exhausted, first, the family is not always maximally professionally competent, and second, the family itself has limits. There are only so many relatives. As a result, the company may remain strong, but only as a mid-sized player. In American business and society, there is a higher level of trust in outsiders. Professional competence takes priority there and, at a certain point, becomes more important than personal closeness to the owner. And this moment of letting go, when you can bring in an outsider who is a professional, trust them, and calmly receive returns, is critically important for the transfer of power. Again, I wouldn't frame this as something uniquely Ukrainian. They would probably say there are religious or cultural reasons behind it, but I completely agree with the challenge you're raising.
Building on your point, perhaps in more developed Anglo-Saxon or continental systems, they have a well-established institution of fiduciary duties at a fundamental level. They also have a strong institution of professional business managers, and culturally it's easier to trust them because this is already a well-tested mechanism. So yes, I agree with you.
It's a well-developed framework of agency relationships.
Exactly.
Right.
Sergey, what's your view?
I believe these challenges can be both objective and subjective, meaning psychological. Indeed, an owner often treats the business like their child and may struggle to separate from it psychologically. That's certainly one scenario, but there can also be entirely objective situations. For example, when a CEO being considered for the role is not yet ready to fully perform as a CEO. And of course, there should be a proper onboarding plan for bringing that person into the role.
I also support the point about trust and this parental relationship to the business. I really like the idea about cultural differences. I fully agree with it. However, in situations like this, it's common to criticize the owners. They hired a CEO and it didn't work out. But I think more attention should actually be given to the board, if one exists in the company, because the board serves both as a support mechanism and as a safeguard against potential issues. My perspective is that I tend to understand the owner more in this situation and place greater focus on the board's role. role. I want to offer another example. That is the opposite scenario. When the board decided to remove the CEO from management, I'm referring to one of the most well-known cases in global business practice. What happened at Apple Inc. Not when they fired Steve Jobs, because that was actually a disgraceful decision by the board. They failed to consider that beyond being a co-founder and shareholder, Jobs was the driving force of the business, and the board completely overlooked that. But when 12 years later the board brought Steve Jobs back, that is often regarded as one of the best business decisions ever made. The earlier attempt to remove the CEO at the wrong moment nearly drove the company into bankruptcy. So the board can make both highly positive and highly negative decisions. And here's something I'd like to clarify based on your experience. Does the number of attempts matter? For example, the first CEO is seen as a sacrificial lamb right after the founder. How many such appointments does it usually take before the owner says, okay, I'm ready to step back? Or perhaps it's not about the number of attempts at all.
That's a very good question. Indeed, the issue exists on two levels, and here I'll share my own example. In one company, during a supervisory board meeting, we were discussing the appointment of a CEO, and the question of trust came up, something we've all mentioned today. Of course, it's a very multifaceted and fundamental concept, and one of the co-owners said, look, I trust my 5-year-old child. There's no reason not to trust them, right? But if that child is walking near an unfenced swimming pool, I won't trust them to be there alone. I will still stay close to grab their hand if needed, and that's exactly the issue. The first CEO may be perceived by the owner as that 5-year-old child. So there's work to be done both on the mindset of that child, helping them grow and understand risks, and on the mindset of the parent who instinctively wants to keep holding their hand at all times. So the question is, will they grow into this level of understanding in a single iteration, or does it require going through 2 or 3 difficult attempts before appointing someone who truly fits all the criteria? I'll answer somewhat metaphorically, but unfortunately I don't have a definitive answer. In practice, it often happens that the first, or on average the first 1.5, CEOs are sacrificial lambs when the owner directly hands over power, control, and authority. That full package, the CEO mandate, so to speak.
I would advocate for minimizing the number of such attempts because each one is quite damaging for the company and the team. A new CEO typically spends at least a year just getting up to speed, figuring out the environment, the processes, even basic things. And it's not guaranteed that a series of failed attempts will make the next one more successful. That's not necessarily how it works. So ideally, this alignment with the owner should be achieved from the very first attempt. Of course, this is a very risky position for the first CEO who comes in after the owner steps down. That's why I would recommend appointing a highly professional CEO. There is a real risk that the owner will choose a convenient CEO as the first one, continue to control them, step in on operational matters, and effectively render the role meaningless. Formally, there is a CEO, but the owner, still walking around the pool, keeps grabbing their hand. And this raises an important question about separating the interests of the owner from those of the company. If we're thinking about the best interests of the business, I'd argue that it should work on the first attempt. And that requires a truly well-prepared CEO, ideally someone who has already been through this stage in another company.
When an owner steps down from the CEO role and hires someone from the market, it is indeed a very difficult period. During the trial period, the owner may conclude that stepping away was a personal mistake, that they are not yet ready to leave operational management and want to return to it. In reality, many owners are successful in that role, and they can continue running the day-to-day operations because they know the business inside out, and many of them are actually pretty good managers. However, the role of an owner and the role of a top manager are fundamentally different. Owners typically focus on building systems at that level. Unfortunately, when a professional CEO comes in, they have to rebuild a big part of what the owner established.
If I may add one more point. In this context, one possible, though not universal and certainly not a silver bullet, solution is when the owner has a strong -1 level of management, mid to senior leaders such as a CTO, COO, or HR director. Among them, the most mature candidate can potentially become that first CEO. In what sense? That layer of directors who have worked with the owner for a year or more has developed a feel for how the owner operates. The owner has as well. In that sense, it helps avoid this gap or disconnect that often occurs when an external CEO comes in immediately. This break in trust, a alignment, and synchronization. I would even say synchronization of vision, methods, approaches, and even at times the owner's mindset and mood. Sometimes that matters, and that's why this can be one of the viable options. In fact, in my own practice, that's exactly what happened. The first CEO was strong, qualified, and capable, but after 6 months, it didn't work out. And then someone from within the system stepped in, someone the owners already knew and who had been there for quite a while. So yes, that's one possible approach.
You've moved a bit ahead. I had a separate question, but that's all right. Let's follow this direction. By the way, I also wanted to emphasize that it's easiest for an owner to develop trust in someone from within the company, but that comes with a different set of challenges. If decisions in the company have traditionally been made unilaterally by the owner rather than collectively, then an internal candidate first may not be perceived by the team as someone capable of making decisions, and second, they themselves may no longer be capable, having worked within that system, of taking full responsibility and truly replacing the owner. But yes, it is one of the possible solutions. Another scenario is when the owner appears to step back, but in reality does not. This is actually a well-known issue, loss of identity, because the owner cannot see themselves outside the business. What do I even do in life if I'm no longer running this business? They continue coming to the office, continue making decisions, but no longer want to be deeply involved in routine operational work. So, having an executive director from within the company can be an ideal solution. They remain in a second-line role, and there's no need to formally call them CEO. It's better to be transparent about what's happening. Let the owner remain CEO while splitting responsibilities, operations handled by the executive director, and strategic decisions retained by the CEO. This can be a very effective solution, or at least a transitional phase. Thank you for steering the discussion in that direction.
At the same time, continuing this line of thought, there's another variation of the problem. When the owner transfers responsibilities and accountability, but does not transfer what is required to fulfill them, namely the actual authority.
You know, I'd actually slightly challenge the premise of the question, if I may, because in principle, authority is formally transferred. The issue is control over the function and the extent of authority to influence its execution and the methods of carrying it out. That's exactly where a specific case I experienced comes in. It was a real case where a strong CEO came in, but 6 months later he burned out because he was loaded up with authority, handed a set of KPIs and told, deliver. But when a bottleneck appeared, whether in a process or at the level below, the person responsible would quietly go to the co-owners to clarify the CEO's instructions. So in the end, everyone struggled. Companies spent a lot of time and money searching for a CEO, gave them authority, a full mandate for action, KPIs, everything. But what they often don't give is real control and the ability to hit the table when it's needed, to enforce decisions when the system resists or stalls, to remove someone from a role or to step in decisively. Personally, I don't see how you can deliver results without applying a certain level of pressure or influence on processes and people when required. When that mechanism doesn't work, the owners effectively become like mom and dad in a family. Dad or mom with the belt, right? She's the one giving orders because she needs things done. Clean the house, take out the trash, while dad is just sitting on the couch and everything is fine for him. Reading a newspaper or watching TV, the child runs to them, complains, and the second parent overturns the first parent's decision. It's an analogy, but it captures the essence. So, to answer your question, authority is formally granted, KPIs are set, 3, 5, even 8 targets, but the real issue is the lack of a complete mechanism for execution. Right now, as I'm working with companies preparing for investment and building governance structures through boards, I'm approaching this from a slightly different angle. I'm currently focusing not only on KPIs but also on the mechanism of how these KPIs are defined and executed, and whether the people responsible for delivering them will actually have full authority and decision-making power to achieve those KPIs.
Let's call it what it is, a complete toolkit for a leader.
Of a manager.
That includes authority, power, accountability, and everything else needed to perform.
Yes, exactly.
So are men?
Yes, I'd like to add something in support of the idea of a professional CEO. And many years ago, Irina said something that stayed with me, and I still repeat it often. Authority or power is not given, it is taken. So if you are a professional CEO, you must be able to take that authority even if it is not fully handed over voluntarily. This is where the CEO's authority is shown. That's precisely why they are the CEO. If we're talking about the level just below the CEO, then yes, you can define KPIs, authority matrices, and so on. But the CEO must have full authority, otherwise they are not truly a CEO. Someone rising from a CEO -1 position may not fully understand this or may lack the inner core needed to actually take that authority. Someone who has already gone through this in another company has a better chance, if authority isn't readily given, to either step in and take it or to walk away if that's not possible.
We had a case like that where there were quite serious, at times even unconstructive conflicts, as the CEO tried to assert that authority, but ultimately wasn't allowed to, and so he left.
There are also situations where the owner remains highly active and genuinely wants to help the company. Armin and I had an example where we were speaking with an owner who wanted to step down as CEO. We asked, okay, if you step down and we bring in an external CEO from the market, what will you do? You'll have a lot of time. What will you do? And he said, I'll come to the office and help the CEO. We all know how that usually ends.
Well, yes, exactly.
Exactly. In fact, sometimes even the mere presence of the owner in the office becomes a red flag.
Yes, right.
Okay, we've identified the erosion of the management vertical and demotivation, a CEO, and a misaligned decision-making system. What other negative consequences arise when a CEO is appointed but not given the full set of tools or chooses not to take them?
I would also point to the speed of decision-making. If decisions are not made by the CEO and the CEO -1 has to run everything through them, or if the CEO has to get certain decisions approved by the owner, this sometimes causes delays that are simply harmful to the business. It directly affects operational speed and the overall rhythm in which the company functions.
I can also recall a specific case where we, as a supervisory board, went through a very difficult and painful process, with real battles and reinstatements within a company where 50% plus 1 share was owned by the state through the State Property Fund. We were the supervisory board representing the State Property Fund. We struggled to replace the CEO, and then it turned out that we had not aligned this replacement with the newly established leadership of the fund's corporate governance department. As a result, we had a CEO who, within the state structure, had to go through multiple offices in addition to dealing with us. And in their eyes, he appeared to be an unauthorized head of the enterprise. Not de jure, but de facto. We had to step in, guide him through the process, and explain we did, in fact, appoint this CEO because the previous one had already filed other claims that were driving the company into a severe downward spiral. The enterprise itself, he wants to stabilize it, and we already have enough issues here. And you don't trust him and don't give him the ability to actually manage the company. This brings us back to the core issue. The owner, in the form of what I mentioned earlier, a depersonalized state structure with multiple offices that must each be appeased before granting the necessary authority, full control, and influence over processes. As a result, some of our processes were delayed. At that time, there was also a wave of relocation to Western Ukraine. This particular enterprise was located there, and we actually lost several companies from the east that could have relocated their operations to the facilities of the plant we were overseeing as a supervisory board. So, as you said, it's a loss of time and missed opportunity when de jure and de facto authority to make decisions and sign contracts is not aligned. Those opportunities are simply lost.
I believe this has a very strong impact on the employer brand. Because information spreads across the market extremely fast, faster than one might like, and once one, or even more than one, CEO ends up in a kamikaze situation, finding a truly professional CEO afterward becomes extremely difficult or very expensive. In my experience, there was a large, successful company that had to pay significantly above market rates just to retain top management capable of withstanding the conditions of working alongside CEO owners or owners who were deeply involved in the CEO's role without formally assuming it?
You know, I smiled somewhat ironically because this didn't relate directly to the CEO in the company where I worked, but there was still an impact. There was a top executive who changed quite frequently. It was the head of HR. At one point, even one of the independent members of the supervisory board remarked, "All right, we now have the HR report." So, which Victoria is it today? The 9th? Over 3 years, it was the 9th HR director. Even that kind of, rather dark humor started to emerge.
Yes, and the same happens with CEOs. When a new CEO is appointed, the entire team may already be thinking, we'll just outlast this one as well. In other words, they do nothing at all. They simply wait for the CEO to leave or be dismissed. No one even attempts to follow instructions, let alone execute them.
And in all likelihood, this really depends both on the maturity of the CEO and the maturity of the owner. We understand that in reality, dual authority or the transfer of responsibility without corresponding authority is not a very good setup for a company's performance.
So how should the board respond to this? It seems to me that the board's role becomes critically important because a gray zone emerges where the board oversees strategic matters, the CEO is more of a formal figure, and the owner manages operational issues over the CEO's head, while the board assumes responsibility for decisions that are, frankly speaking, made in a rather dysfunctional way. How can the board respond? In my experience, there was a strong case where the board decided from within its own composition to propose an interim CEO, and I was offered this role. In this way, the board, observing how a still relatively young CEO was maturing, used its resources to help him grow into the role. It was a successful case. Over the course of 6 months, together with the future or formal CEO, we worked toward shaping a fully fledged CEO, and this was the board's contribution. I believe the owner would not have taken such a step without the board.
This practice is not very widespread in Ukraine, and in that particular case, the board was able to convince the owner to try it, and it worked.
From this perspective, Sergiy and I often find ourselves discussing the two-tier versus one-tier approaches to corporate governance. In my view, sometimes it can even be useful, so to speak, to experiment with a one-tier board in order to balance, at least temporarily, the voting rights and influence on decisions of senior managers as well. The CEO and the main business makers, you could say, whether it's the CEO, CTO, or whoever is responsible for R&D, should sit on that board and understand, first of all, that it is not an advisory but a partner, that it listens and can make decisions broadly aligned with the direction of operational activity, and that there is no kind of class inequality here, right? These are experts who contribute from a supervisory and advisory perspective, while your role is tactical and operational management. In other words, these are different domains that do not overlap. And in this context, sometimes it can be useful, in my view, for a CEO to participate in the supervisory board with voting rights, even if only advisory as an option, at least in the early stages when a structure is being formed. Now, as I mentioned, I'll refer to 2 current cases where I'm acting as a consultant, and we are working to establish 2 boards in order to attract investment into these businesses. This is a requirement from potential investors, where the board includes co-owners, myself, as a consultant and representative of the investor, and at the initial stage I recommend and propose a one-tier board, also bringing 2 or 3 key directors onto it. So in doing so, I effectively achieve several objectives at once. First, I help instill a culture of collective board-level decision-making. The second point is that developing an understanding that a supervisory board is beneficial both for management and for the owner. And accordingly, the main tasks are already about creating a genuinely effective board that serves as both a tool and an intermediary between the investor and the business. That's the approach. I've perhaps given you a broader answer to your question.
If I may, I would also like to share my perspective on this. Honestly, I think the board needs to be able to say no many times, and in many situations it has to be a multi-domain no. At the initial stage, when an owner first comes forward with the idea of stepping away from operational management, the board must thoroughly assess the situation and be prepared to say no if the company is driven exclusively by single-person decision-making, lacks any real systems, and there is a clear understanding that once the owner steps back, either nothing will function at all or the owner will never be able to trust the organization because there is no systematic way of working and everything is concentrated in one individual. In such a situation, changing the business leader is also highly risky for the company. And here the board must clearly say, no, my friend, please either build this yourself first. Without the board, we can come in later. Or, if you are unable to do so, which can also be the case, especially when the owner is entrepreneurial but inherently chaotic, and that is often the reality. The more successful and entrepreneurial a person is, the less system-oriented they tend to be. Otherwise, they would not be as entrepreneurial. It is a natural trait. If the board sees that the owner cannot build this alone, then it can say, let us help you. But again, there is a no here as well. You do not interfere, you step back. We, as a board, work with your C-level team and build the system together. The only question is if a C-level team exists. If there is no C-level, then there is effectively nothing for the board to do. We have already discussed this, I believe, in the first session. The next no should come at the point when the board has decided that it can bring in a CEO. The CEO is appointed, and at that stage, they must be given the freedom to prove themselves. The no for the owner, in this case, concerns interference. Clear checkpoints should be established, whether monthly or quarterly, when the owner, the CEO, and the board meet to review reports and assess the CEO's performance. And that is a no. From the board to the owner, it must be firm enough. There will not be just one sacrificial figure. We agreed that it is better to achieve a successful case from the very first attempt.
Yes, and continuing this line of thought, we had a real case in practice where, after analyzing the situation, we set a condition for the owner to remain in CEO role until we completed the systematization process. Beyond the fact that any CEO in that situation would have been set up to fail, there was also an additional benefit. The owner makes decisions quickly. During restructuring and system implementation, their involvement is highly valuable because everything moves forward rapidly without the conflicts of interest that might arise if another person were in that position.
We have now naturally arrived at the point where we can outline the stages. So, what should the process look like? Let us assume the company is ready for change, that the earlier no's have been addressed. The board has made the decision, yes, we can search. What should the process of integrating a CEO into the role and the subsequent support look like?
In my view, it should begin with formalization. I strongly believe in the tool of a delegation of authority matrix, where the board helps the owner and the current or incoming CEO, ideally someone who already has such experience, systematize and clearly define who holds which authorities. Start by putting that division down on paper.
May I add something to this question? And how does this most often work in Ukrainian companies? How should it be? And what do you actually see in practice?
Unfortunately, even when authorities are formally defined, which is not always the case, they often remain on paper. Everything is handled situationally. This can be explained because the risks we are facing, it is impossible to anticipate and document all of them. Quite often, companies have to make fast, high-stakes decisions, particularly regarding expenditures on security and other critical areas. As a result, the environment we operate in frequently turns formally defined authorities into something that exists only on paper. But they just remain on paper, and in practice things work differently. That is why, in my view, the board must quite often step in to fine-tune and adjust matters as needed, depending on the context, returning at least to that authority matrix and holding it up in front of the owner, most often the owner, and pointing out, this is what we have agreed. If there are grounds for change, then we need to sit down and discuss it. So it seems to me that everything begins with formal definition on paper, and then reality introduces its own adjustments.
All right, we have outlined the starting point. What are the next steps? Or perhaps, Roman, you see a different process.
Exactly. One could say that the next step, or perhaps half a step after defining the authority matrix, is a set of parameters that are included in management reporting and in rhythmic reporting cycles. This is something that often emerges in business practice. It is no secret to anyone that financial indicators must be measured, recorded, analyzed, validated, agreed upon, and adjusted. However, it is equally clear and widely acknowledged that management reporting and financial or tax reporting are fundamentally different, and every company is different. Some manufacture cars, others produce detergents, and some are engaged in coal mining. Accordingly, management reporting, particularly the first three core elements, tends to be industry-specific. They should be the first 3 points we look at in terms of our perception of the industry, our competitors, and our own sales funnels, and the points from which cash flow is generated specifically in relation to our product. And product quality should also be part of this. If I recall, for example, Volodymyr Popereshnyuk from Nova Poshta, this is reflected in reporting product quality first. He is passionate about it. That's one of the reasons why Nova Poshta is considered exemplary, because the owner's DNA is built into the company. Mr. Volodymyr, to his credit, has always prioritized quality. And that's where a CEO relies on rhythmic reporting and a set of clean, crystal clear 6, 7, 8, or 10 key management metrics, not to be confused with financial reporting.
We are looking at this process from the perspective of non-executive directors. So how can the board be useful here? What is the board's role in this process?
In the authority matrix?
Or in CEO onboarding, is that what you mean?
In the process as a whole of bringing in the CEO, onboarding, and establishing them in the role.
The board adds credibility to the company in the eyes of candidates. When candidates meet the board, when they understand that a board is in place, even at the very early stages of engagement, and when the board then follows up during the CEO's adaptation period or the onboarding of a C-level executive, it is extremely valuable because it represents a perspective distinct from the owner and their team that can provide support. Candidates value this highly. Therefore, if the goal is to get it right on the first attempt, the board's role during the adaptation period is critically important in supporting that process, identifying what is not working, where authority is lacking, and what challenges the new CEO is facing with the team, the market, or the industry. It's like an additional support mechanism for the CEO and, in my view, increases the chances of success.
I would also like to expand on this from the perspective of feedback. Everyone is familiar with ABC analysis as a relatively simple way of assessing the quality of employees within a company. A players have a specific set of competencies that define why they are considered A players. And one of those competencies is a constant desire to receive feedback. Those who operate at their maximum and is confident they are delivering a good product always want to double-check, is it well done? Where should I move? There is also a very vivid example from the world of racing. When a 7-time Formula 1 champion, who matched Michael Schumacher's record, was asked, "What do you fear most in Formula 1? And we know there have been terrible crashes and extreme speeds, 340, 380 kilometers per hour. Yet he said, "What I fear most is losing radio contact with my team for even 5 seconds while I'm racing." In other words, for an A player, feedback is everything. That is a world-class top driver. And these top executives, the board should create and encourage them. Of course, initiative should also come from the CEO if they have a backbone. Personally, I always want feedback. Always. You can even compare this to a child, you know. A child is not yet shaped by all the social layers and constraints. They draw something, a crooked tree or a simple picture, and for them it is perfect. They run up and say, "Mom, Dad, look, see how great this is." Similarly, someone who truly delivers quality work does not hide and think, as long as no one bothers me, the report will come eventually, and hopefully I'll just get through it. No, even in interim stages, he will initiate more frequent reporting, sharing both the quantity and the quality of their work. This feedback loop, in my view, is critically important, and the board serves as the receiver of that feedback.
When we talk about the failures we observe in Ukrainian boards, I would highlight the role of a board that begins to protect the owner, takes the owner's side, and effectively serves all of the owner's wishes. As we have discussed, the owner often has many fears at the moment of transferring authority and, most importantly, power, the full set of decision-making tools. And this is what we most often see, and it is precisely what later leads to significant negative consequences. The opposite scenario is when the board starts protecting the CEO. It completely distances the owner and says, "Give a carte blanche. Do not engage with us for a year. We will handle everything here." But this only increases the owner's level of distrust and anxiety. In reality, the solution is quite simple. The board has no right to take either side because the board represents the company and must act in the company's best interests. And when the board sees that it is in the company's interest, for example, to bring the owner back, like the case of Steve Jobs that I mentioned earlier today, or conversely, to distance the owner as much as possible and give the CEO maximum autonomy, the primary consideration should always be where the company benefits and where the risks lie. So in answering your question about the board's role, it comes down to this. Whose interest does the board represent? Once that is clear, everything falls into place in terms of what the board should do.
In other words, the role is to strike the right balance between the owner and the CEO, in the interest of the business itself.
Yes, with a clear understanding of whose interests you are defending, not the owners and not the CEOs. Your interest is the company, and then the balancing becomes aligned with understanding where the company is going. Once the direction is clear, the how follows naturally.
The board's role is indeed critical in integrating a CEO into the company, in the CEO search process, and in preparing the organization to bring in a CEO from the market, especially if the owner previously performed that role. There are likely situations where the board becomes powerless when all options have been tried, or when circumstances require action that is not aligned with the CEO's interests.
Generally speaking, I believe that a powerless board should step down. Otherwise, what purpose does such a board serve for the business? If it is powerless in relation to the CEO, there may well be other critical areas where it is equally ineffective. So unfortunately, in this case, I do not see any kind of magic wand.
Building on your point, the board itself must also have something like a backbone, a collective backbone. If the CEO has an individual one, then the board must come together and, when necessary, push back against an ineffective or biased position, whether from the CEO or the owner, in the interest of the business. And if that backbone is truly lacking, then the board needs to have the courage to take a step back, to formally recuse itself in legal terms.
Harakiri should come first from the board of directors or the supervisory board, and only then from the CEO.
And events unfold as they will.
In fact, I had planned to close with a quick scenario-based question about what actions you would take, whether to step down or not. But you have essentially already answered that. The only thing I would add is this. Recusal can be collective, and ideally it is when the entire board recognizes the issue and agrees on it. Not everyone is always sufficiently self-aware or willing to leave their position. In that case, only those who are conscious of the issue should act. It may be just one person, but the only right decision is to step down and leave the board if you are unable to change anything.
Right.
But somehow it ended very sadly for us. The conclusion and final outcome were sad, so I suggest that in the end, a quick closing round. One positive piece of advice for boards specifically, not for owners. What should they do when separating the roles of owner and CEO?
I would put it this way. It is a matter of execution. This is why in businesses where boards are introduced, things don't work out. A board can define strategy, plan, assign ambitious objectives, and even source investors, and so on. But if execution does not work, all of this becomes useless and delivers no value. That is why the CEO, who ensures execution, the right choice of that CEO, their proper support and guidance, is, in my view, one of the board's most critical responsibilities. Without this, even the most brilliant board, no matter how strong its individual members are, will not be able to ensure the achievement of strategic goals. And then you can start pointing fingers at each other about why it didn't work, saying the board misplanned it or management failed to deliver. But the outcome will be negative for both the owners and other stakeholders. Therefore, the board must ensure that execution exists. Yes, the board does not execute itself, but execution is essential for its decisions to be implemented.
I agree that the board should not operate in the clouds, regardless of how distinguished its members are or how many strategies they have developed across different companies. They must look at the business itself and identify its real problems. They need to understand the key issues the business is facing and from there approach budgeting, strategy, the design of business processes and internal control systems, starting with areas that are critical or at risk of becoming so. Together with management, they should help address and stabilize these issues and only then move on to broader strategic work. That is when a sense of alignment emerges, a strong connection between the execution team and the supervisory team. That is what makes it work.
I would say don't look for compromises and don't reinvent the wheel. Keep following established standards of corporate governance. That includes building a succession system. And if such a system doesn't yet exist in the company, then through building a succession framework, you can, in principle, later systematically identify and onboard a CEO and make that case successful. Even if the CEO role is still performed by the owner, a well-functioning succession system works well.
Or harakiri, first the board, then the CEO. Colleagues, thank you very much for such an engaging discussion. Indeed, situations like this, where owners, for various reasons, don't transfer the full set of authorities required to perform the role of a CEO are very common. And this is something we encounter on a regular basis. So thank you very much for your perspectives, your advice, and your insights.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for providing a platform where these insights can be openly discussed. Thank you, Sergiy.
Thank you. Please share your ideas. This is an invitation both to our guests and to our listeners and viewers. Let us know which other problem areas you would like to highlight and we will discuss them.
The email address for your submissions will be in the description of this video. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you in the next episodes.